They say global money shifts loudly, that you'll hear the cracks long before the world changes course. But the truth is far quieter than that. Sometimes, the largest transitions in monetary power arrive like a tide at night, slow, steady, and unnoticed until the shoreline has already moved. While everyone is watching the headlines, the shouting matches, and the predictions of a financial apocalypse, something far more subtle is taking place. In the dim corners of trade desks from Shanghai to Dubai, in the quiet backrooms of central banks that never speak openly, a new settlement language has begun to whisper through the system, the PetroYuan. This isn't a revolution, at least not in the way many analysts dramatize it. It's not a direct assault on the US dollar, and it's not a declaration of financial war. It's something strategically more dangerous: a second channel, a silent lane, an alternative pathway that builds mass without triggering alarms. What makes this mechanism so unsettling isn't its volume, but its design. It grows by avoiding confrontation. It expands by avoiding headlines. It survives by avoiding attention. You can track the oil barrels, sure. You can see the tankers moving across the oceans. But you cannot easily track the incentive structuring, how they are paid for. You can measure the dollar flows, but you cannot see the quiet decisions happening beneath them. Decisions made in private meetings, through encrypted messages, and in bilateral agreements that never make it to the front page. And somewhere inside that quiet, a critical question forms. Why? Why would nations that publicly swear loyalty to the dollar system begin clearing energy trades in yuan when no one is looking? What is motivating them to take on the risk, even a small one, of using a different currency for the world's most important commodity? The answer isn't ideology. It isn't some grand act of rebellion. And it's definitely not de-dollarization in the dramatic, geopolitical sense that gets pushed by the loudest voices online. It's something much simpler, more systemic, and far more revealing about how power actually behaves in the 21st century. The PetroYuan grows because it solves problems that no one wants to admit exist. It provides escape routes that no one wants to talk about publicly. It offers leverage without appearing confrontational. And above all, it gives energy exporters something the dollar system no longer promises with absolute certainty: insulation. Insulation from financial surveillance. Insulation from weaponized capital flows. Insulation from sudden, politically motivated asset freezes that can alter a nation's trajectory overnight. Think about it from the perspective of an energy-producing nation. For decades, the deal was simple. You sell your oil in dollars, and you park those dollars in US Treasury bonds. It was a stable, predictable system. But in recent years, that system has started to feel less like a neutral utility and more like a tool of foreign policy. The use of sanctions, the freezing of central bank reserves, these actions have sent a chilling message across the globe. The message is that access to the dollar system is not a right. It's a privilege, and that privilege can be revoked. Money is never neutral. The choice of which currency you use to settle a trade is never just political theater. It is an incentive map. It's a quiet, deliberate reconfiguration of who must depend on whom. When you choose to settle in dollars, you are implicitly agreeing to play by the rules of the US financial system. When you choose to settle in yuan, you are signaling a desire for an alternative set of rules. But here's the part of the story that makes it so uncomfortable, the part that rarely gets discussed. This expansion isn't happening through grand alliances or historic declarations like the Bretton Woods Agreement. You won't see a press conference with world leaders announcing a new monetary order. Instead, it's happening through 1,000 small, almost invisible actions. It's happening through bilateral deals between two countries, through subtle quirks in trade contracts, through quiet discounts offered for paying in yuan, through preferential clearing lanes that make yuan transactions just a little bit faster or cheaper. It's growing through the oldest force in global finance: mutual dependence. Nations don't switch systems out of pride or spite. They switch when the cost of staying becomes heavier than the cost of leaving. They switch when the old architecture gives them fewer and fewer reasons to remain loyal. They switch when someone offers them a path that requires no public announcement, no dramatic break, no confrontation at all. The PetroYuan offers exactly that: a silent off-ramp. Let's look at the mechanics. China is the world's largest importer of oil. This gives it immense leverage. It can go to an oil producer, say in the Middle East or even Russia, and say, "We will buy a significant portion of your output, but we would prefer to pay in our own currency, the yuan. To make it worth your while, we might offer you a slight discount on the price, or maybe we'll invest in your country's infrastructure as part of the deal." For the oil producer, this is a tempting offer. They secure a long-term, high-volume customer. They get a good price, and they begin to build up a reserve of yuan. Now, what do they do with that yuan? They can't just park it in a bank account. They need to be able to use it. And this is where China's strategy gets really clever. They've created a system where that yuan can be immediately converted into gold on the Shanghai Gold Exchange. So, the deal isn't just oil for yuan. It's oil for yuan, which is convertible into gold. This links the currency to a hard asset, giving it a level of credibility that it might not otherwise have. It bypasses the dollar system entirely. Oil leaves one country, yuan flows in, and that yuan can be swapped for a universally accepted store of value. It's a closed loop, and the most dangerous part of this shift sits even deeper than the transactions themselves. It is the structural truth that no central banker or politician will ever articulate on camera. When a new settlement channel forms, it rarely tries to compete directly with the old one, not at first. It coexists with it. It operates in parallel. It handles the trades that the old system either can't or won't handle efficiently. But over time, as it proves its reliability, its stability, and its utility, it begins to quietly absorb the flows that matter. This is why the PetroYuan is expanding so quietly. Not because it is weak, not because it is merely symbolic, but because its silence is its most powerful weapon. If it were a loud, aggressive competitor, it would be met with an immediate and overwhelming response. But as a quiet, parallel option, it flies under the radar. It becomes integrated into the financial plumbing before anyone has a chance to sound the alarm. Each small deal, each new contract settled in yuan, adds another brick to this new architecture. Individually, they are insignificant, but together, they are building a formidable structure right alongside the existing one. Think of it like two highways running side by side. For a long time, everyone uses the main, 8-lane superhighway, the dollar system. It's big, it's fast, and everyone knows how to use it. But then, small, 2-lane access road is built next to it, the PetroYuan system. At first, only a few cars use it, maybe to avoid a bit of traffic or because it is a more direct route to a specific destination. But then, the access road gets wider. More on-ramps and off-ramps are built. And one day, the main superhighway has a massive traffic jam, a financial crisis, a set of sanctions, a political dispute. Suddenly, that quiet side road doesn't look so small anymore. More and more traffic diverts to it, not because they hate the main highway, but because the side road is simply the more practical option at that moment. And once that traffic shifts, it doesn't always shift back. People get used to the new route. They build businesses and infrastructure around it. What started as a small alternative becomes an essential part of the network. This is the real story of the PetroYuan. It's not about overthrowing the dollar tomorrow. It's about building the infrastructure that makes an alternative possible, and then waiting for the inevitable moments of stress in the primary system. The global monetary map is changing much faster than the headlines suggest, and the reason is that every major central bank in the world already knows this. They are all watching. They are all modeling the scenarios. They are all quietly adjusting their own strategies in response. The part they will never explain to the public is how fast a silent, parallel system can become an irreversible one. To understand why the PetroYuan is quietly expanding today, we need to rewind the clock. Forget the BRICS headlines and the de-dollarization hype. The Bretton Woods system had just collapsed. The 1973 oil shock was sending tremors across the world, and in the middle of it all, the petrodollar was born. When the U.S. unlinked the dollar from gold in 1971, it left a massive void. The world needed a new anchor for global trade. To keep the dollar at the center, Washington had to find something just as essential as gold. That something was oil. Through a series of quiet agreements with the Saudi royal family, a new system was forged. Oil would be priced exclusively in U.S. dollars. In return, those dollars, the petrodollars, would flow back into the U.S. economy through investments in treasury bonds. It was a brilliant, self-reinforcing loop that brought stability and mutual benefits. For nearly 50 years, the system seemed unbreakable, but the world doesn't stand still. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, a new giant was rising in the East. China's industrial engine was roaring to life. Its factories and cities were consuming staggering amounts of oil and gas. This created a strange paradox. The world's next economic superpower was forced to buy its most critical resource, energy, using the currency of its biggest geopolitical rival. This didn't sit well in Beijing. It wasn't about overthrowing the dollar, at least not at first. It was a matter of strategic vulnerability. Every transaction could be monitored. Financial flows could be turned into a weapon, and holding massive reserves in dollars gave Washington immense leverage. From the West, this was just the way the world worked. From China's perspective, it was a hidden weakness. But China is a patient player. It has a long memory. It watched what happened to other nations that challenged the dollar head-on. They were sanctioned, isolated, or destabilized. So, China studied these lessons carefully. If it was going to redraw the global financial map, it would do so with quiet, deliberate moves, not open confrontation. The first subtle shift happened in 2009, and almost nobody noticed. China and Russia agreed to settle some of their trade in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar. The amounts were tiny, almost symbolic, but the principle behind it was profound. It was a blueprint for the next 15 years. Real change doesn't happen in the headlines. It happens in the margins. Small deals pile up silently. Norms shift gradually. A negligible percentage of global trade, layered over a decade, becomes significant. And because each step is so small, no alarms go off. This was the genius of the early PetroYuan strategy, not speed, but stealth. Then came 2014. Russia's annexation of Crimea and the Western sanctions that followed changed everything. For the first time, a major energy exporter was partially cut off from the dollar system. This sent a shockwave through global markets. It wasn't just about Russia. It was a wake-up call for everyone. The message was clear. If your interests ever diverge from Washington's, your access to the global financial system could be used against you. Your settlements could be blocked, your reserves frozen. This unspoken threat resonated far beyond Moscow, echoing in the halls of power in every nation that had ever felt the weight of U.S. foreign policy. The next pivotal moment was in 2018. The U.S. imposed sanctions on Iran's energy exports and pressured global payment systems to comply. Suddenly, Asian countries that depended on Iranian oil were trapped in a maze of restrictions. But necessity is the mother of invention. Iran started accepting Chinese yuan for its oil. Then, it used that yuan to pay for Chinese infrastructure projects. A closed-loop, circular economy was born, operating alongside the dollar system, but not dependent on it. Again, the volume was small, but the logic was powerful. When the main highway is blocked, you find another route. The PetroYuan wasn't expanding because of some grand ideological revolt. It was expanding because countries needed a backup plan. They needed insulation, stability, and options. And then came 2022, the event that truly shattered the old world order. After the invasion of Ukraine, Western powers did the unthinkable. They froze Russia's central bank reserves. Not just the assets of sanctioned oligarchs, but the sovereign wealth of a G20 nation. For decades, the world operated on a core belief. Central bank reserves held abroad were sacred, untouchable. February 2022 destroyed that illusion. Behind closed doors, finance ministers and central bankers from Asia to Africa to Latin America started frantically re-evaluating their risk. If Russia's reserves could be frozen overnight, whose were safe? It became terrifyingly clear that sovereignty wasn't just about how much money you had, but where you kept it and how you could access it. Holding all your nation's wealth in a single currency suddenly went from being prudent to being reckless. This was the historical catalyst. BRICS could not have engineered on its own. The idea of settling oil sales in yuan, the so-called PetroYuan, suddenly had a story that required no propaganda. The new narrative was simple. Diversification wasn't rebellion, it was just smart risk management. Even close allies of the United States started to get nervous, questioning the wisdom of having all their financial eggs in one basket, a basket entirely controlled by the dollar-dominant clearing system. But here's the part that so many analysts get wrong. Countries didn't rush to diversify into the yuan because they thought it was a better or stronger currency than the dollar. They did it because they needed an alternative, any alternative, that existed completely outside the jurisdiction and reach of the dollar system. What mattered wasn't picking a side or aligning with a new ideology. What mattered was having structural optionality, having a plan B. The historical foundations for this shift, for the expansion of the PetroYuan, also lie in China's long-term, patient diplomatic strategy. Think about how the petrodollar system was built. It was largely a partnership between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. China, on the other hand, pursued a completely different kind of architecture. It wasn't about one big deal. It was about weaving a complex web of bilateral agreements. This web stitched together energy exporting nations with a mix of trade dependencies, massive infrastructure deals, and tempting financial incentives. Through its landmark Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing financed everything: ports, railways, power grids, mining operations, and even digital infrastructure across dozens of countries. These deals were never just commercial, they were fundamentally monetary. Every single infrastructure project that spurred trade also created a need for settlement. And every new settlement channel was a golden opportunity to introduce yuan flows into countries that previously had none. These agreements gave China incredible leverage, not because they forced anyone to use the yuan, but because they made using the yuan incredibly easy. Convenience is perhaps the most underestimated force in all of monetary history. Nations rarely overhaul their entire reserve frameworks because of a powerful speech or ideological pressure, but they will absolutely adapt to whatever settlement mechanism reduces friction and makes life easier. China understood this principle deeply. It knew that quiet architecture always beats loud declarations. So, instead of standing on a stage and demanding that oil exporters accept yuan for their oil, China simply created a multi-layered structure of incentives. It offered a buffet of benefits: massive investment flows, critical infrastructure financing, currency swap lines to ensure liquidity, bespoke currency agreements, discounted energy contracts for loyal partners, and preferential access to the massive Chinese consumer market. One by one, country by country, nations found that settling trades in yuan was becoming more and more practical. A system doesn't grow through domination, it grows through inertia. Once the ball is rolling, it's easier to keep it rolling than to stop it. But the deepest historical root of the PetroYuan lies in something even simpler, something fundamental: the global trade imbalance. Today, China buys far more oil from the Middle East and other producers than the United States does. While the U.S. became a major energy producer itself thanks to the shale revolution, China became, and remains, the world's largest energy importer. And every importer has leverage, especially when your economic weight is so massive that it literally shapes the global demand curve for a commodity. Beijing understood this power, and over time, it began to offer its energy partners something the dollar system never really needed: to predictability. It offered long-term contracts that locked in demand for years. It provided infrastructure guarantees, ensuring that the means to produce and transport that energy would be built. It enabled local currency investment flows and opened the door for those countries to access the Chinese domestic market. The U.S. could always rely on the overwhelming strength and ubiquity of its currency. China, on the other hand, had to rely on the overwhelming strength of its demand. Both are forms of power, but only one of them is actively expanding its reach today. This is the point where the historical path quietly shifts from just a narrative to a concrete mechanism. PetroYuan settlement gained momentum not because China was publicly challenging the dollar, but because energy exporters quietly recognized a simple truth: Aligning your settlement currency with your largest buyer just provides stability. It makes sense. They could hedge against currency fluctuations using those swap lines with the People's Bank of China. They could take the yuan they earned and reinvest it directly back into Chinese markets, something that has become increasingly difficult with U.S. dollars due to sanctions on certain financial flows. And most importantly, they could diversify away from that single point of vulnerability in global finance. The world rarely understands the importance of silence in major monetary transitions. Think about it. Gold was replaced by the dollar without some grand global announcement or a signed treaty. The euro absorbed huge settlement flows long before Europe had fully integrated its financial structure. And now, the PetroYuan is expanding by following the exact same historical script. No one officially admits that a major change is happening until that change is already irreversible. You can look at every major transformation in financial history and you'll find the same pattern. Necessity creates incentives. Incentives create new flows of money. And those flows eventually create entirely new systems. What the PetroYuan represents today is not the dramatic collapse of the dollar, as some might have you believe. It's something more subtle, and perhaps more significant, the maturing of the global monetary ecosystem. It is an evolution where a single point of failure, the reliance on one currency and one system, is becoming distributed across multiple settlement architectures. It's a move towards a multipolar financial world. But the quietest historical truth is also the most important one. Whenever a new settlement system forms, it never begins by directly challenging the incumbent king. It begins by solving the problems that the incumbent system ignores. The Bretton Woods Agreement solved the post-war problem of unstable, competing currencies. The petrodollar solved the problem of anchoring the global economy after the gold standard was abandoned. And the PetroYuan is emerging to solve the modern problem of geopolitical exposure in the critical energy trade. The world doesn't really switch systems overnight. It accumulates them. And in that quiet accumulation, power shifts, often without making a sound. The twist in this story is that PetroYuan's rise has almost nothing to do with China's ambition to replace the dollar. That narrative is loud, flashy, and convenient for people who like simple geopolitical scripts. But the real story, the one unfolding quietly beneath global markets, is driven by something far more fundamental: fear. For 50 years, the petrodollar system ran on a hidden rule. As long as geopolitical alliances were stable, monetary neutrality was guaranteed. But that unspoken promise shattered the moment major energy exporters saw how fast reserves could be frozen, accounts cut off, and payment systems politicized. Suddenly, the game changed. This isn't about exporters suddenly trusting the yuan more. It's about them no longer trusting that any single channel, no matter how dominant, can stay apolitical forever. And when trust in a system cracks, it doesn't collapse with a big bang. It just quietly starts rerouting itself. So here is the twist that most analysts are still underestimating. The PetroYuan isn't expanding because China is pushing it. It's expanding because the dollar system is pushing exporters to find alternatives. This doesn't mean the dollar is failing. It just means the old equilibrium is gone. In the past, settling in dollars was a convenience. In this new world, relying exclusively on the dollar has become a concentration risk. And when risk changes, systems adapt long before the headlines ever catch on. The PetroYuan isn't a revolutionary challenger. It's the emergence of an option. And sometimes, an option is more powerful than a revolution. But the real twist isn't happening at summits or in grand political declarations. It's happening in the fine print of contracts, in the renegotiations between national oil companies and state buyers. This is the part of the system we never get to see. We're talking about clauses that allow for partial settlement in yuan, hybrid invoicing, or settling in yuan, and then immediately converting it to a local currency through swap lines set up by China's central bank. None of this makes the news, but every single one of these contracts adds to a network effect, growing silently until it reaches a critical mass. By the time the world wakes up to how big the PetroYuan channel has become, it will already be hardwired into the global energy trade. Now, let's talk about the plumbing of the financial world. because settlement isn't controlled by ideology. It's controlled by who has the smoothest pipes. For decades, the dollar had no real competition, not because America forced it on everyone, but because no one else could build a reliable alternative. But China has spent the last 15 years doing exactly that, quietly building the infrastructure. We're talking about swap lines, clearing banks, digital payment platforms, and cross-border settlement systems that allow the PetroYuan to function smoothly, right alongside existing dollar flows. Everyone assumed the yuan could never scale because of China's capital controls. But China engineered a clever workaround. Exporters don't need free-flowing capital to use the yuan for settlement. They just need predictable channels to convert, reinvest, or hedge their money. And China provides those channels, not through openness, but through control. Ironically, the very capital restrictions that Western economists criticized have created a unique kind of stability. Some exporters find it useful to deal in a currency that can't be easily attacked by speculators, shorted uncontrollably, or manipulated by foreign powers during a crisis. Stability comes in different forms. Some nations prefer a transparent, free market. Others prefer a controlled one, especially when that controlled system treats them predictably. But perhaps the most important twist of all is psychological. Nations don't switch their settlement currency because they expect a new one to take over the world. They switch because they no longer believe the old one is completely invulnerable. The moment a system is seen as a potential liability, even a small one, alternatives instantly gain legitimacy. China doesn't need the PetroYuan to replace the dollar. It just needs it to be an acceptable option. And every year, more countries are quietly shifting their mindset. They go from, "we would never use the yuan," to "we could use the yuan if we had to," "we already use the yuan for some of our trade." This mental shift is irreversible. Once a country builds the infrastructure to settle even a tiny portion of its trade outside the dollar system, the psychological dependency is broken. From that point on, the PetroYuan's influence expands almost automatically, without any loud political statements needed. And here's the final twist, the one that's truly structural. In the short term, the growth of the PetroYuan doesn't weaken the dollar, it actually strengthens it. Why? Because as nations start experimenting with alternatives, they often hold even more dollars as a safety buffer. They build a parallel system while keeping the old one fully intact. This dual-track approach increases the demand for liquidity on both sides. The PetroYuan expands, but the dollar remains central. It is only over very long cycles that these shifts in settlement patterns translate into shifts in structural power. And this is exactly why the transition is so hard to see. It's why analysts miss it and why policymakers avoid talking about it. A new system can grow and evolve without the old one collapsing. Both can coexist, side by side, until one day, they can't. If you understand this, you understand the real situation we're in. The world isn't watching a currency war, it's watching a settlement migration. And migrations, unlike wars, don't announce themselves with trumpets and declarations. They just happen, quietly. To understand how the PetroYuan actually works, not the headlines, not the speculation, but the real internal architecture, you have to strip away the geopolitical noise and look directly at the plumbing. Because beneath all the speeches and summits, the PetroYuan isn't a political project. It is a system of incentives built on financial rails that China and its partners have spent over a decade constructing, piece by piece. And like all hidden financial systems, the deeper you go, the clearer the structure becomes. At its core, PetroYuan settlement is built on 6 interconnected layers. Each layer solves a specific problem that historically prevented the yuan from being used in the global energy trade. What makes the system a potential challenger isn't that it aims to dethrone the dollar, but that it systematically removes the frictions that once made dollar settlement the only game in town. The first layer is trade denomination. This is the simplest, yet most symbolic step. When an oil exporter agrees to invoice a portion of its shipments in yuan, it might seem like a small change. The volumes are modest, the announcements are quiet. But denomination is never just a line item. It's the moment two nations formally acknowledge that a non-dollar channel exists. China started this with small contracts for Russian crude. then expanded to Iran, and later set up pilot programs with Gulf exporters. What made this possible wasn't political persuasion, but raw economic leverage. China is the world's largest crude oil importer, buying over 10 million barrels per day. Exporters don't denominate in yuan for ideological reasons. They do it because the biggest buyer on the market gets to shape the rules. The data shows how this leverage works. China buys roughly 30% of Saudi Arabia's oil exports, nearly 45% of Iran's, and a huge share from Russia since 2022. These numbers matter because settlement norms follow demand. The U.S. could shape oil settlement in the 1970s because it was the dominant buyer. Today, China is the gravitational center of energy consumption, and the math of trade volume is the foundation of monetary influence. The second layer is clearing infrastructure. This is where the system goes from symbolic to functional. Clearing is the invisible bloodstream of settlement. Nothing moves until the clearing system moves it. For decades, large-scale yuan trade was impossible because the channels were slow and bureaucratic. China's solution wasn't to open up its capital controls, but to build an entirely new framework. The Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, or CIPS. Launched in 2015, CIPS is often misunderstood as a Chinese SWIFT replacement, but that's not quite right. SWIFT is a messaging system. CIPS is both a messaging and a settlement system. It's the core pipeline that PetroYuan flows through. Its growth has been explosive. In 2023, CIPS processed almost 80 trillion yuan, with double-digit annual growth. Over 1,400 institutions in nearly 120 countries are now connected. These numbers aren't close to SWIFT's scale, but for the energy trade, global dominance isn't necessary. What you need is reliability, reach, and insulation. CIPS provides all three. Messages sent through CIPS don't rely on Western financial channels, which means they can't be easily disrupted by sanctions. Energy exporters understand this perfectly. A smaller, insulated pipeline can be far more valuable than a large, vulnerable one. PetroYuan thrives on that distinction. The third layer is bilateral swap lines. This solves the oldest problem in yuan settlement: liquidity. Without deep, liquid yuan markets abroad, exporters would be stuck, dependent on China's tightly controlled domestic liquidity. China's solution was elegant. It built a network of currency swap lines between its central bank and foreign central banks. These swap lines allow countries to get yuan directly without needing to go through open currency markets. The scale is significant. China has signed over 40 of these agreements with countries in the Middle East, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The most strategic ones are with Qatar, the UAE, Russia, and Turkey. These lines let foreign central banks provide yuan to their own local institutions. This makes yuan settlement a practical reality, not just a theoretical option. It also solves another big problem: volatility. With a swap line, exporters don't have to hold large amounts of yuan and worry about currency risk. They can settle in yuan and immediately convert it to their local currency. This flexibility is critical. The system doesn't ask exporters to trust the yuan. It asks them to trust the infrastructure. The fourth layer is reinvestment channels. This is what makes the PetroYuan architecture self-sustaining. When an exporter receives yuan, they have to be able to do something with it. If that yuan can't be reinvested or exchanged efficiently, the whole system breaks down. China solved this by opening specific pathways that bypass its own capital controls. Exporters with yuan balances can now invest in China's bond market, which is one of the largest in the world, worth over $20 trillion. They can use platforms like Bond Connect to buy Chinese bonds without setting up an office in China. They can also put that yuan into infrastructure projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. This creates a perfect circular flow of capital. China pays for oil in yuan. Exporters reinvest that yuan into Chinese-led projects. China secures its energy supply, and the exporter gets new infrastructure. This isn't ideology. It's pure economics, and the data backs it up. Foreign holdings of Chinese bonds have grown massively over the last decade. With these reinvestment channels in place, the PetroYuan becomes more than just a currency, it becomes a feedback loop. The fifth layer is the hedging architecture. This solves the final technical barrier. Energy exporters need tools to hedge their exposure to the yuan, especially for long-term contracts. So China built a derivatives market centered on the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, or IN. The IN launched a yuan-denominated crude oil futures contract in 2018. This instrument has gained real traction, allowing exporters to hedge price risk directly in yuan, instead of relying on dollar-based tools like Brent or WTI. On top of that, offshore yuan markets in Hong Kong, Singapore, and London offer currency forwards and options. This lets exporters manage the risk of the yuan's value changing. For a long time, the gap between the onshore and offshore yuan was volatile, but China has worked hard to stabilize it. The more stable the offshore yuan became, the more feasible PetroYuan settlement became. Hedging is the hidden machinery beneath all global trade. Without it, no system can scale. The sixth and final layer is the incentive-driven settlement loop. This is the true engine behind PetroYuan's growth. China learned from the history of the petrodollar. Systems only survive if they create financial incentives that are too good to ignore. So instead of just asking exporters to switch, China built layered incentives. It offers discounts on oil contracts settled in yuan, ties infrastructure financing to yuan settlement, provides interest-bearing accounts for yuan reserves, and gives preferential trade treatment to nations using its CIPS network. These incentives create a structural gravity that pulls nations into the PetroYuan orbit, even if they don't want to publicly challenge the dollar. The system grows not because of political allegiance, but because exporters find it's in their own financial interest to diversify. Incentives always reshape behavior faster than diplomacy. But the mechanics go even deeper. When China pays for oil in yuan, that money doesn't just disappear. It circulates back into China through those reinvestment channels we talked about. This gives China's central bank a powerful new tool. It can manage these incoming flows to control its domestic money supply. This creates a tight link between China's foreign trade and its internal monetary policy, giving the People's Bank of China a level of influence that Western central banks, operating in open systems, just don't have. Most people think it's just about China buying oil in its own currency, but the real story is in the architecture. It starts with a network of yuan clearing banks spread across the globe in places like Qatar, the UAE, and Singapore. These aren't just regular banks. They are designated hubs, pumping yuan liquidity directly into regional financial systems. When an oil exporter in the Middle East gets paid in yuan, they don't have to navigate a complex Chinese system. They can settle right there, through a local clearing bank. This decentralizes access and makes using the yuan almost frictionless. These banks are the nodes connecting the entire PetroYuan network, pulling in trade flows and pushing out liquidity. But what makes this a real system isn't just one piece. It's how all the pieces lock together. You can't have trade in yuan without the clearing banks. The clearing banks would be useless without central bank swap lines providing emergency liquidity. The swap lines wouldn't work if there was nowhere to reinvest the yuan, and nobody would bother with any of this without clear incentives. The PetroYuan isn't just a currency. It's a synchronized architecture where every part supports the next. Once a system like this becomes coherent, it's incredibly difficult to dismantle. Now, what do oil exporters actually do with all this yuan? You might assume they're just piling up massive reserves, but the reality is more sophisticated. Often, they immediately convert the yuan back into their own currency using those swap lines or clearing banks. So, their direct exposure to the yuan is minimal. But here is the crucial point. Even if the exporter ends up with 0 yuan on their balance sheet, a huge portion of that energy trade has completely bypassed the US dollar system. It's the pathway that matters, not the final balance. Global financial systems don't shift because currency reserves change. They shift because the pathways for settlement diversify. Every transaction settled this way carves a new route on the global financial map. And then there's the digital frontier. China is way ahead with its digital yuan, the ENI. It's already in advanced pilot stages, including for cross-border payments. Imagine an oil exporter receiving payment instantly in digital yuan the moment a shipment is confirmed. This could completely bypass the old, slow correspondent banking networks. While it's still early days, the potential is enormous. A digital settlement architecture could accelerate PetroYuan adoption for faster than traditional methods ever could. The more countries experiment with it, the more normal non-dollar settlement becomes. China is also a master of economic statecraft. Many of its Belt and Road Initiative deals have clauses allowing infrastructure loans to be repaid in yuan. This creates a perfect loop. An energy exporter earns yuan from selling oil to China, and then they can immediately use that yuan to pay for a new port or railway built by China. This gives the yuan immediate utility. It's not about the yuan being a superior currency. It's about China creating a closed-loop ecosystem where the yuan has a clear purpose. It's the same circular logic that made the petrodollar so dominant in the 1970s, just updated for the 21st century. Let's talk about credit. When an exporter receives yuan, isn't just dead money. It can be used as collateral for borrowing, especially if their country has a swap line with China. In financial hubs like Hong Kong, offshore yuan deposits can be used to create new credit. This is the critical leap. The yuan is transforming from just a currency for trade settlement into a currency for funding. This is how all great global currencies grow. The dollar did it with the eurodollar market. The yuan is doing it with a hybrid system of offshore and onshore channels. But what makes the yuan unique is that its rise isn't built on open markets. It is built on controlled channels that offer stability to its partners, a very attractive proposition for countries that have been burned by currency volatility in the past. There are also silent incentives at play. When exporters agree to price oil in yuan, China often offers them better deals behind the scenes. We're talking about things like discounted shipping, longer payment terms, or special access to its own markets. You won't read about these deals in the news, but within the industry, everyone knows they exist. These quiet benefits create a powerful ratchet effect. Once a country starts settling a portion of its trade in yuan, it rarely goes back to zero. Why would it? It's getting a better deal and diversifying its geopolitical risk at the same time. And this isn't just about bilateral deals between China and one other country. It's becoming a regional phenomenon. As trade within blocs like BRICS grows, regional banks in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East are starting to offer yuan-denominated accounts, loans, and trade finance. The PetroYuan is evolving from a simple bilateral arrangement into a regional liquidity ecosystem. When the entire supply chain starts using yuan from local importers to major exporters, the currency becomes deeply embedded. The system grows not through dominance, but through saturation. The deeper you look, the clearer the logic becomes. The PetroYuan isn't challenging the dollar as the world's primary store of value. It's challenging the dollar's monopoly on settlement architecture, and settlement systems can shift much faster than reserve systems. Oil exporters don't need to replace all their dollar reserves with yuan. They just need to get into the habit of using yuan for specific trade flows. Once that habit forms, the system expands almost automatically. The numbers are starting to back this up. According to SWIFT, the yuan is now a top 4 global payment currency. In global trade finance, its share is over 5% and climbing. China itself reports that over 20% of its own trade is now settled in yuan. These percentages might sound small, but settlement shifts are not linear. Getting the first 5% is the hardest part. Getting the next 20% is much easier. Once a currency becomes woven into the fabric of global settlement, it's almost impossible to remove. Geopolitical uncertainty is also a massive accelerator for the PetroYuan. For countries facing sanctions or political pressure from the West, the yuan is more than a currency, it's an insurance policy. Nations like Russia and Iran aren't using the yuan out of ideology. They're using it because it offers them an escape valve from the dollar system. Every time a country gets cut off from dollar access, the PetroYuan system grows stronger. It's a counter-system that thrives on global friction. China's ambition is brilliantly subtle. It doesn't want the yuan to replace the dollar. It just wants the yuan to be unavoidable. In the end, It all comes down to the one thing you can't see on a balance sheet: trust. The dollar system was built on the belief that it would remain apolitical. That trust has weakened. The PetroYuan system doesn't need global trust. It only needs bilateral trust between China and its partners. And that is far easier to build and maintain. When you layer all these mechanics together, the picture is undeniable. We aren't watching a simple currency war. We are watching the quiet, methodical construction of a parallel settlement universe. The petrodollar system was born to solve a crisis. The PetroYuan system is growing because it solves a different one. And in that quiet evolution, we can see the future of global trade taking shape. In the end, what makes the story of the PetroYuan so unsettling isn't its size, but the silence in which it continues to grow. Think about it. Systems that want to take over the world usually make a lot of noise. They announce themselves with grand declarations. But systems that want to survive, they start in the shadows. And the PetroYuan has lived almost entirely in those shadows. It's been built piece by piece, through quiet contracts, small agreements, and a long series of choices that, when you stitch them all together, reveal a new monetary map of the world. The real danger isn't when a new currency suddenly appears. The danger is when the old system starts to crack and no one even notices. And that's exactly where we are right now. Yes, the dollar is still strong. It's dominant, deeply embedded in every major financial artery of the globe. But it's no longer the only game in town for major energy exporters. The illusion that there's only one way to do business has been broken. And once a system loses its aura of being the only option, the alternatives don't need to overthrow it. They just need to exist. There's a deeper truth here, one that policymakers rarely say out loud. Global finance doesn't shift because of some big, dramatic crisis. It shifts because of accumulation. 1,000 small decisions, made in ministries, central banks, and the boardrooms of oil companies, slowly start to redirect the current. By the time the river has fully changed its course, everyone looks back and says they saw it coming all along, but they didn't. The PetroYuan is a perfect example of this slow, creeping inevitability. Its power doesn't come from its scale, but from the optionality it provides. Every single oil contract that gets settled in yuan, no matter how small, reduces the world's dependency on the dollar by that much. Every exporter who starts experimenting with yuan hedging is building a small shield against future political shocks. Every nation that gets tied into Chinese belt and road infrastructure finds it more and more convenient to settle trades in yuan. Every currency swap line China signs gives another country a way to operate outside the exclusive dollar framework. These aren't revolutions. They're just adjustments, but adjustments add up. The quietest warning sign, however, lies even deeper. Settlement systems, the plumbing of global trade, always shift long before reserve systems do. Reserves, the savings accounts of nations, change after the world has already accepted a new way of settling payments. The petrodollar didn't become king because central banks just decided to buy dollars. It became king because energy started being priced and paid for in dollars, and the central banks simply followed the money flows. If the PetroYuan continues to expand using this same logic, then we could see national reserves follow the same path. Not in a dramatic crash, but in a gradual rebalancing. Imagine a world where 60% of global reserves are in dollars, instead of today's nearly 70%. A world where the yuan's share grows from a tiny 3% to maybe 10 or 15%. A world where countries don't just have one emergency fund, but several in different currencies. That world isn't chaotic, it's diversified. But it's also a world where the United States loses the quiet, immense advantage it has held for decades: the ability to shape the entire global financial cycle through the sheer gravitational pull of the dollar. This isn't just about geopolitics, though. It's structural. Any system built on a single point of failure eventually develops cracks. For decades, global trade has been tied to one settlement currency, one clearing system, one reserve logic. The PetroYuan introduces something the system hasn't seen in over half a century: a second channel. And second channels don't just coexist peacefully. They change the entire dynamic. They give oil exporters more leverage. They give importers more options. They give sanctioned nations a lifeline for survival. They give rising powers a new tool for influence. They create a world where money and liquidity can move in more dynamic, less predictable ways. If you only see the PetroYuan as a competitor to the dollar, you're missing the bigger picture. But if you see it as a sign of structural drift, you start to see the entire architecture of global finance slowly shifting before your eyes. What China has built isn't just a rival currency, it's a pressure valve for a world that has grown wary of relying on a single system. And once a pressure valve is opened, it never fully closes again. To truly grasp this, imagine a dark room filled with dusty files, filled with secrets that were never meant to be read. One of those files contains a quiet, fundamental truth. Global power doesn't shift when empires fall. It shifts when the underlying systems evolve. The dollar isn't going to collapse overnight. The PetroYuan isn't going to replace it tomorrow. But the world is already learning to live with two monetary lungs instead of one. And once the global system learns how to breathe differently, the old rhythm never fully returns.